The title of the talk is Making Sense of Germany's Indifference to Contemporary Antisemitism as Fascism. I'm going to use sort of one framework to understand why Germany has turned Israel into a human punching bag, and why Germany is largely ignoring mushrooming anti-Semitism in the country. And that framework is by two German Jewish Marxist philosophers, sociologists. Many of you may have heard of them. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. Horkheimer here is on the left, Adorno's on the right. And there's a series of pictures of them. It's basically the same pictures, except for this one that's an exception. Both of these men were sort of, in Germany, they're considered master philosophers on the level of Hegel, Marx, Schopenhauer, or in that tradition, Hannah Arendt. They're not terribly well known in the United States, except at the New School for Social Research, and a couple of other universities in the United States that focus on continental philosophy. As I mentioned, they're Jewish. They fled the Hitler movement and went to London and then settled in the United States, and actually did a study for AJC. Many folks don't know that, the American Jewish Committee in the 40s on anti-Semitism. And then they returned to Germany and taught in Frankfurt. They were part of this school called the Frankfurt School. I'm focusing on them because they developed this theory, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify it, but it basically says that in response to the Holocaust, in response to the extermination of 6 million Jews, Germans developed a pathological sense of guilt about the Holocaust, those that were both complicit and those who responded to the Holocaust, successor generations. And their theory was called, and they had a fancy sociological term for it, guilt, defensiveness, anti-Semitism. It was later termed secondary anti-Semitism. So there's all these sort of fancy academic terms for it. But the idea is, in response to the Shoah, Germans reacted in a way where they wanted to purge the guilt of the Shoah. And how did they purge guilt? They turned the victim into a victim again. And to understand this concept, an Israeli psychoanalyst, Zivi Rex, I don't have a picture of him, in the 80s, described it as, and with biting sarcasm, many of you may have heard this before, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. Right, this very famous quote. And that in this one sentence, Zivi Rex, this Israeli psychoanalyst, captures what these two philosophers outlined in their writings. This idea that in order to cleanse one's guilty conscience about the Holocaust, the Jews need to be punished again. It gets into some taps into some very deep ideas about social psychology. I would argue that this idea of the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz has expanded across Western Europe into the concept of Western Europeans largely won't forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. That means this notion, because of the complicity of Western Europeans in the Shoah, the French, all of Europe, with the exception, one could argue, of Denmark and Bulgaria, but even the Bulgarians participated, as we know.
Albania is an exception.
Albania too, but I'm thinking Western Europe. One could argue Denmark, but there was also people who were complicit. So this idea, anti-Semitism over the last 20 years, maybe longer, has developed into this notion of, especially in Western Europe, the Western Europeans won't forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. And that seems to me the best explanatory model for why there's a bottomless pit of hatred of Israel in Europe. And I've spent nearly 20 years of my life in Israel, or in Europe, and it's endless. One government study in Germany from a couple of years ago, I wrote about this in the Jerusalem Post, said that 40% of Germans hold a modern anti-Semitic anti-Semitic view of Israel, meaning they blame Israel for everything. They compare Israel to Nazi Germany, the usual anti-Semitic parallels. That's 40% of the population of 82 plus million. I strongly suspect, because the way these questions were framed, that the number would be well over 90% if they did if the researchers did a more sophisticated study, and really tried to draw out German attitudes on Israel and Jews. Well, by the way, I'm going to talk for 20, 30 minutes and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. Good questions are better than good answers, and it's better to have crossfire. Or I could talk for 4 to 5 hours and we can stay here, and about German anti-Semitism. I'm sure you'll be wildly enthusiastic about hearing this topic until 11 o'clock at night. So that's the framework I'm going to be using. There's also two other thinkers I should say, who have developed this idea of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. Anyone recognize this guy? What was he?
Well, he's a famous author.
Right?
That's basically.
His name's right there. Fassbender, right. He's a playwright, filmmaker. He died. He's a gay, German, non-Jewish filmmaker. Very popular among people on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, I suspect. I know that they had retrospectives of his films when I grew up here in the 90s, I think. In any event, he wrote a play, and it's called, let me just get the exact title here because I don't know the title in English, how they translate it. It's called The Garbage, the City, and Death. And Fassbender was accused in this play back in the 80s of being anti-Semitic. He wasn't, but some very sensitive Jews in Frankfurt believed he was, and they stormed the stage where his play was supposed to be performed and occupied the stage, and the play wasn't performed. This was the Frankfurt Jewish community. This is what Fassbender wrote, and I think it's worth citing in his play. This is a comment from a anti-Semitic character in the play. I'm quoting, open quote. "And the Jew is guilty because he makes us guilty, because he is there. If they had gassed him, I'd sleep better today. They forgot to gas him. That's no joke. That's how the thinking goes inside of me," close quote. See, Fassbender's idea here is, again, this notion of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. The mere presence of Jews, whether American Jews like yourself, I'm assuming all of you are American, French Jews, Israeli Jews, the mere presence of Jews conjures up that memory of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, etc., etc., and creates that level of pathological guilt that one wants to erase. And that's what Fassbender's onto here in the 1980s in his play. The German Jews in Frankfurt didn't understand it. One thinker who did understand it is this man, Henryk Broder, on the right, who was a Polish-born Jew. He's alive today. He's born in Poland in 1946. In 1958, they fled Poland because of communism and anti-Semitism in Poland. Both his parents survived concentration camps, and they went to Vienna and then to Cologne. So his first language was Polish. He writes in German, and he's one of the most influential journalists in Germany, one of the most prominent. He also happens to be my mentor, but I could never write like him. The only way I can describe him to an American audience is Mark Stein is the Henryk Broder of North America. So that's, he writes, do folks know Mark Stein, I'm sure? Yeah. This very polemical, satirical way of writing, but he's Mark Stein on steroids on some level. He dips his pen or his keyboard in acid and he fires away, and he's been writing about anti-Semitism for, I think, over 40 years. And he was the one who developed this notion that Fassbender was not anti-Semitic, and Broder has delved into this idea that, what Fassbender said, that's how the thinking goes inside me, meaning this mechanism of blaming, of not forgiving the Jews for Auschwitz or forgiving the Israelis for the Holocaust is what's permeating German society right now. And he's been writing about this, as I mentioned, since the 70s. And this is now, it's still relatively new stuff for Germany, because the Germans tend to think contemporary anti-Semitism is merely, or is when a group of Nazis tossed Jews into cattle cars and deport them to Auschwitz. Anything below that level is not anti-Semitism. I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, but you get the point. The point is that right-wing anti-Semitism in Germany is recognized as anti-Semitism. That is Nazi-style anti-Semitism, or when a few neo-Nazis in Eastern Germany who are unemployed march in some small town in the province, and suddenly there are tens of thousands of Germans who are willing to engage in civil disobedience to stop, the new seizure of power by the Nazis. Now, I'm being sarcastic, but you get the point. But on the other hand, when tens of thousands of, or thousands, it depends on the city, of German Muslims allied with German leftists march to declare that Israel's a Nazi state, to issue the most fantastical defamations of Jewish nationalism, of Jewish sovereignty, the most vile comparisons between Israel and the former South African apartheid state, and burn Israeli flags, there are largely no counter-protesters. Politicians don't show up, German progressives don't show up, the left is largely non-existent. That's the reality in Germany. Left-wing anti-Semitism and Islamic-animated anti-Semitism are largely not on the radar screen to combat. Now, I'm going to just, one sentence I thought that was relevant to understand why Indifference is so disturbing is from Sir Ian Kershaw. Many of you may know of him, British historian who wrote these famous biographies, or biography of Hitler and Nazi Germany. He once said, open quote, "The road to Auschwitz was built by hate, but paid with indifference," close quote. It's a very nice quote, and it neatly captures, I think, what's happening in most of Europe. I'm an advocate of Aliyah. I don't think there's much of a future for European Jewry, the 1 million Jews who are currently in Europe. And Kershaw understands the dangers of indifference and where that leads. In my view, German political leaders have not internalized this sentence. Although Germany has built a Holocaust memorial in the center, the problem, I think, with these types of Holocaust memorials is they're not really about memorializing or commemorating 6 million Jews, but it's about massaging or cleansing one's own guilt. It's a monument for Germans, and that's what it's, I think, largely turned out to be. The previous writer was a sharp critic of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. It was built by, what was his name, Daniel? It'll come to me. The architect, not the architect. He's an architect, Daniel. No, not Libeskind, the other Daniel. It'll come to me. But Broder consistently satirized and mocked this Holocaust memorial for being just a disaster.
Is that the anonymous grave?
Yeah, these gray stones that are in the center of Berlin's government district. You know, when people take pictures and laugh and and are dancing on the gray stones, Broder would argue, I believe, and I think he's done that a couple of times, that's exactly what the monument's about. It's exactly what the Germans expected. Don't criticize it, because that's what's expected. Now, I'm going to transition a little bit to Peter Eisenbahn, thank you. Why did I think his name was Daniel? Thank you. Right, where he made some anti-Jewish joke to his dentist too. I think he was criticized. I'm going to talk a little bit about Germany's UN voting record. Let me just get the article here. The picture, I should say. That's Moss. 1 second. Okay, here we go. scroll down when I took it away. This is Germany's, I'm transitioning now just to outline some examples of what I see as German indifference to contemporary anti-Semitism, recent examples, and Germany's infatuation with criticizing Israel and bashing Israel. This gentleman, his name is Christoph Heusgen. He's the Germany's UN ambassador to Israel. Just last week, and I wrote about this in the Jerusalem Post, as you can see the headline, German ambassador to UN compares Israel to Hamas. Now, by way of background, Germany and Israel were both jockeying for position to secure a seat on the UN Human Rights Commission, UN Security Council, excuse me, last year. Germany promised Israel the seat, then backstabbed Israel and took the seat, and Germany managed to secure more votes after it had pledged to Israel that you can get the UN Security Council seat. And by way of background, there's a wonderful commentary by Benny Avni in the New York Post about this. If you want to look it up, he writes, it's an Israeli-American who writes commentary. He wrote something on Turkey today, I saw. So he wrote about this, or broke the story, I should say, last year. At the time, Germany's foreign minister, Heiko Maas, said, that gentleman here, said that if Germany's on the UN Security Council, we can protect Israel's interests and advance them. Of course, that didn't happen. Last year, Germany voted 16 times with the Islamic Republic of Iran to condemn Israel at the UN. And in the Security Council, as I just pointed out, the Heusgen, the UN ambassador, compared Israel's dismantling of the homes of Palestinian terrorists, compared that action with Hamas rocket attacks against Israeli civilians. So it didn't turn out as Maas would say. Now the reason I'm pointing to Maas here is because it gets to the point of Germany's indifference to anti-Semitism and also sort of a moral anti-Semitism at work. Maas said last year, when he became the Social Democratic Foreign Minister of Germany, that Germany has a coalition government, the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, the Christian Social Union, it's a Bavarian Christian party, and the German Social Democrats. So three parties make up Merkel's coalition. He's from the Social Democrats, the second largest party. He became foreign minister last year in a reshuffle of the coalition, and he said, I went into politics, and I'm quoting him, because of Auschwitz. Good. Now what has he done since he's gone into politics because of Auschwitz? He, again, I'm going back to February of this year, so just 2 months ago, he had his deputy foreign minister, this gentleman, Niels Ahnen, it took him, I think, 13 years to get a bachelor's degree, I read, in history. He was the head of the Young Socialist Party in Germany, which is the youth organization of the Social Democrats, and these people usually go on to be the chancellor if the Social Democrats win. He's currently the deputy foreign minister. So Heiko Maas had this gentleman and the head of the Iran desk go to the Iranian embassy in Berlin and celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Republic of Iran's revolution, a revolution that calls for the destruction of Israel, calls for the destruction of the United States. So what happened was, you can see in the German here, they wrote the sentence here, is a politician allowed to block journalists on Twitter? So this is a response to me on Twitter. What happened was, after he went to the embassy, I wrote about this for the Jerusalem Post. I think I wrote about it for FoxNews.com. Or I wrote 2 stories. And I spread the stories, of course, on Twitter, and the story started to circulate in the English-speaking world. And sometimes Germans get very bent out of shape when unsavory actions by the government start to appear in the English language press, especially in the United States, for reasons I can delve into later. So what he did was he blocked me on Twitter. I wasn't even following him. And his Twitter account is not designated as private. It's designated as Deputy Secretary of State for the Foreign Affairs Department with, I think, a link to the Foreign Affairs Department, if I'm not mistaken. So a lawyer, pro-Israel lawyer, decided to ask me, a pro-American, I should say, a pro-Israel lawyer in Hamburg, said, do you want me to file a legal claim, pro bono, to get him to unblock you because it's free, it's a matter of free speech. I said, sure, I can't afford it, but, go ahead and take legal action. So he filed a lawsuit, a temporary injunction that forced Niels Annen here, to unblock me on Twitter. So, and then of course the story became a story about freedom of press in Germany, and this newspaper, which is the Bild here, as you see, it's the largest, it's the most highly circulated newspaper in Europe. It's sort of like the New York Post in many ways, in that it's in that flavor, but it's the largest circulating paper in Europe, and every politician is required to read it because it's so influential. So a story, which is interesting, and this gets to my point about indifference, a story about a German politician and the head of the Iran desk, or a German diplomat, I should say, who supported Iran's revolution. And Annen said after the articles came out about him attending this event at the embassy that he had no regrets, quote, no regrets about attending support for Iran's revolution. And the German press, with the exception of the Bild, I believe was the only newspaper that reported about Annen attending this, this event at the embassy. But in response to this scandal about press freedom, a number of large papers picked up this Twitter article, and they had to mention that Weinthal wrote about Annen celebrating Iran's revolution. So in a weird way, the coverage only took place about Germany's support for a genocidal anti-Semitic regime because of a press freedom case, not because of the anti-Semitism that should have been the triggering cause for the article. The scandal, of course, is press freedom, but the real scandal on some level is Germany is openly celebrating a genocidal anti-Semitic regime in Tehran that in January publicly hanged a man based on an anti-gay charge, and they have no qualms about it. Now, on that note, we can go to Germany's president, and I think this is where if I'm not mistaken, where I wrote this is Germany's Social Democratic president. His name is Frank-Walter Steinmeier, former foreign minister of Germany. He was caught by the Bild paper. The Bild is probably the only paper in Germany that really is sensitive to the issue of anti-Semitism and Iran. Just one paper, for the most part. There are a couple of others, but the Bild is very, very sensitized to the issue of not publishing anti-Semitic articles or articles that stoke hardcore anti-Americanism. So this gentleman sent a telegram, you can see the headline from the Jerusalem Post, to Iran's regime in February again, praising the regime. His excuse was, once the story came out, well, other German presidents have also sent telegrams. He was forced to release the other telegrams from previous. So what we have is a cross-party support for Iran's regime. It's not just the Social Democrats, it's the Christian Democratic Party, the Free Democrats. Any president who's been of a different party has, according to all these telegrams over the years, praised Iran's revolution. Now, the fundamental question, I guess, from the Israeli perspective and also from the Jewish perspective is how does this square with Merkel's declaration to the Israeli Knesset in 2008 that Israel's security for my administration, meaning the Merkel administration, her government, is non-negotiable? That's what she said to the Israeli Knesset in 2008. Steinmeier's response to this warm telegram, who sends a telegram these days anyway? I'm trying to figure that out, isn't it? And it's the most bizarre thing. A telegram? It's it's like something out of like a Western in 1895.
But it can't be traced in a sense. It's not on Twitter. It's not on Facebook.
You could just send a letter, right? A certified letter. Why a telegram? that would be the question I would ask him too. Why not an email? Right, you're right, then it would be traced, but you can send a hand-delivered letter from the ambassador. In any event, his response was, Steinmeier, well, other presidents have done this. So some Iranians on Twitter, or some critics said, well, that shouldn't make it any better. Like, what does that mean? That only makes it worse. But there was no sense of sort of internal self-reflection or internal self-criticism about this policy of praising Iran's regime. Now, one of my beats is European-Iranian relations. So I've been writing for since 2004 about European-Iranian relations and German-Iranian relations. So this topic fascinates me because of the sort of soggy uber appeasement from the Europeans toward Iran's regime. And because I consider Iran's regime to be the most dangerous regime and social system in the world right now because of their efforts to export terrorism. Just the other day I wrote, I'm making a bit of a tangent here, on a new Iranian spy that was arrested in Sweden, for possibly attempting to, it's unclear what if he was attempting to assassinate dissident Iranians, but he was spying on what appears to be a dissident Iranian group in the Netherlands. And he was arrested by the Swedish authorities just a few days ago. But this has been a long series of attacks. Iran's regime, going back to Germany, contracted a Pakistani engineer in Bremen to spy on Jewish institutions, pro-Israeli groups, and a Jewish French business professor a number of years ago. He was arrested and sentenced to a little over 4 years in prison in 2017. The response by Germany, and it was leaked, well, we warned the embassy not to do this again. I mean, what is that? A simple slap on the hand. I mean, if the Iranian government, and this was the Al-Quds force, has contracted a Pakistani to assassinate him, the German authorities believe that he was contracted to assassinate pro-Israel advocates and Jews. We don't know what exactly the target was, but there was, the authorities believed it was an assassination plot. You would think the Germans would have at least the political sanity to recall their ambassador at a minimum, evict the Iranian ambassador for a few weeks, issue human rights sanctions on Iran, something to show that they want to stand up to anti-Semitism. But again, you have another example, not only of indifference to anti-Semitism, I would argue, but where they're engaging in no form of deterrence to prevent Iran's terrorism plots in the future in Europe. So in fact, it's actually giving a shot in the arm to Iran in some way to continue your plots because you're not going to face any real penalties. So that's the Iran point. Now I just want to talk a little bit about this woman. Folks recognize her? I'm switching topics a bit.
Yeah.
Very good. Right, and folks know what happened to her in the United States, I assume.
But she got deported.
Expelled.
Right. Why?
She blew up the pizzeria in Jerusalem.
No, that's not.
No, she expelled because of immigration fraud.
Right, because she lied on her immigration fraud, or immigration document that she wasn't convicted of terrorism. She blew up an Israeli supermarket in the late 1960s and then bombed the British consulate. She killed 2 Hebrew University students and was imprisoned, I think, for 10 years and then released as part of the prisoner exchange, then entered the United States under false documentation and was deported, I think, 2 years ago, or I can't remember, a couple of years ago, I believe. So now she's back in Jordan doing work as a member for the Popular Front, PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It's an EU and US designated terrorist organization. She was a member. I don't think her membership has changed much given her views. So she entered Germany last month to deliver a talk on BDS and the Palestinian women's struggle. Germany, she applied for a visa in Jordan. German authorities claim they didn't know who she was. You do a simple Google search, you know. I'm honestly convinced that half the German government does not know how to use a Google search based on the number of terrorists entering the country. And she was admitted to Germany as part of a BDS alliance, or BDS alliance group invited her to speak in Berlin. Everyone here knows, I'm sure, what BDS is. Okay. I was at one talk I delivered for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I asked in Chicago once, and this was a few years ago, and folks didn't know, a couple folks asked me what BDS was, so now don't make that dangerous assumption. So she entered Berlin and was scheduled to speak. I wrote an article in the Jerusalem Post. This was stating she was deported from the US in 2017. This is by my colleague from the Jerusalem Post, writing that Berlin group is hosting a convicted PFLP terrorist. She's slated to speak. Again, the German authorities were largely indifferent. I spent hours on the phone and emails writing the authorities at the time I was in Berlin for work, asking them, you know, do you plan to deport her? She's a terrorist. And they said, we don't have that right. I went to the cities. The city has sort of like a interior department. They said, we're not in a position to do that. You have to check with the Interior Ministry, the federal government. The federal government said, we can't do that. So it was this typical sort of, you know, Kafkaesque bureaucratic shuffle that leads nowhere, because German authorities feel very comfortable behind the bureaucratic counter, but they don't feel comfortable taking action against a raging, lethal anti-Semite. So I contacted the U.S. ambassador to Germany, Richard Grinnell. Many of you may have heard of him. He's been in office less than a year. He's widely considered Trump's go-to ambassador in Europe. I did a lengthy profile on him if folks are interested for the Washington Examiner. He's a Christian Zionist. Trump's the most openly, the most senior and openly gay official for the Trump administration. He has been going to great lengths to combat all of these outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Germany through statements, through other measures. I've never experienced anything like this in my nearly 20 years of reporting on anti-Semitism in Germany. This is an American ambassador who's from Michigan originally, now lives in California, who was a spokesman for John Bolton when he was at the UN. So Grinnell, to cut to the chase, issued a statement saying this woman should not be allowed to speak. We should condemn this because it'll feed into more anti-Semitism. After he released his statement, which I published over at foxnews.com, the German authorities the next day suddenly were jolted into action and said, we're going to deport her based on this law, where she's disrupting. They have a law that, where if speakers or are disrupting the peaceful coexistence of the democratic order, that could be a basis for evicting these types of people. So suddenly, the Germans went into action. And this was, the Israelis complained too, and other groups, but this had been going on all week. So I think that's interesting from the point of view of the US, that you have an ambassador right now in Germany, who, I think someone mentioned this right before the talk, played an instrumental role in getting a neo-Nazi removed, a Nazi removed from Queens. That case, I don't know who said it here. Yeah, that Nazi who was deported from Queens last year because Trump focused on that, said I want him out of the country, was also spearheaded by this U.S. Ambassador Grinnell, who was strong-arming the Germans constantly to accept this Nazi because they didn't want to accept him. So he died once he got into German soil where he belonged. It's a very interesting time from my perspective as a journalist, because I've never seen this type of combativeness toward German indifference with respect to anti-Semitism by the American government. This is really quite new and interesting, as I said, for a journalist who writes about these topics. Now let me just go into couple of other recent scandals that I think might be of interest. So this gentleman here is, Germany's developed, that means commissioner of the state government, the commissioner of the state government against anti-Semitism. He's an anti-Semitism commissioner in Baden-Württemberg. It's a southwestern German state. I think that's where BMW is located, if I'm not mistaken. No, that's Bavaria. Stuttgart, so it's Mercedes-Benz is located there. So this gentleman, just by way of background, so Germany sort of recognizes on some level that anti-Semitism is part of their national pastime. So what they've done in response to all of these outbreaks of anti-Semitism, including violent anti-Semitism, is appoint commissioners for anti-Semitism, which is sort of a sign that their efforts to combat anti-Semitism are failing, because they need these commissioners. Like, what do you do to fight anti-Semitism? You centralize the fight. It's sort of similar to the Holocaust Memorial in Germany. What do you do to memorialize dead Jews? You centralize the commemoration. Similar to what the Nazis did in a weird way, right? And paradoxically, what did the Nazis do? They centralized the extermination of Jews in Berlin. So this effort to centralize things, I find a bit odd. Now, this gentleman, Michael Blume, that's his name, is now the commissioner to fight anti-Semitism in Baden-Württemberg. He spends most of his time on Twitter, or spends a great deal of his time on Twitter, trashing German Jews. I wrote an article about him because the Weinthal Center called for his resignation because he called a prominent German Jew, her name is Malka Goldstein-Wolf. I wrote about this. He compared her to Adolf Eichmann in one of his articles. This is the guy that's fighting anti-Semitism in a German state. And he called Malka Goldstein-Wolf, who many of you may remember, was the woman in Germany. She's an anti-BDS activist who got German television stations a number of years ago to cancel a broadcast of Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. She started a petition campaign, was filled with high energy, and managed to convince, because there had been an anti-Semitism scandal at this network, and the timing was right, and Malka raised the issue of, why are you promoting Roger Waters? All he does is hold concerts in Europe trashing Israel and Jews. And they canceled the broadcast of his show. This gentleman decides, Michael Blume, that Malka is somehow the equivalent of Eichmann because Malka said, why are you working with groups that support the Muslim Brotherhood? This is a gentleman who thinks that a Muslim Brotherhood group in Germany, an Islamic group, is somehow a respectable partner in the fight against anti-Semitism. Now, friends of mine say Germany, they say, is an Irrenhaus, meaning Germany is a insane asylum now because of this type of stuff. I laugh, but when you see these mounting number of examples, you have to ask yourself, has Germany abolished itself? Now, this is one example. I'll deal with one other example, and we can open up for questions, because I could go on, as I mentioned, till 11 o'clock. And I wanted just to capture some of the local flavors since February. Again, I could go back, there's just an endless series of scandals. I can't keep up with them. You would need at least, 50 or 60 reporters just to cover the anti-Semitism scandals in Germany, just to get, probably half of what's going on covered. Now, the last example I want to mention is, who mentioned the Anna Frank? Yes, thank you. This is the most recent scandal, because it gets into some very bizarre dynamics that I frankly don't understand. Maybe some of you can help explain that to me when we go into the question and answer. There's a German educational center called the Anne Frank Center in Frankfurt. Now, there's one in the U.S., there's one I believe in the Netherlands. They seem to be popping up everywhere, an Anne Frank Center that's devoted to education about anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia in Germany. They run, lectures and hold conferences. pass out material that no one reads, but it's there. They said in a series of 5 tweets last month that German Jews who lost their citizenship during the Holocaust are comparable to Islamic State terrorists from Germany who are facing the loss of their citizenship. You may have seen this article. I wrote about it, and then after I wrote about it for the Jerusalem Post, the Daily Mail picked it up in the Times of Israel. In any event, this is what happened. This center, because Germany is now debating legislation or some type of policy, it's unclear, where German Islamic State terrorists who voluntarily joined the Islamic State in the war theaters of Syria and Iraq would lose their citizenship. Other states are, also debating this. And you can be for or against it. It's open for debate. But then the center on its Twitter feed went into this rambling analogy between Jews like Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt, who were stripped of their citizenship by the Nazis, and comparing them with Islamic State terrorists. Now, they, of course, then I wrote them on Twitter, and there was this big back and forth between us on Twitter. No, we didn't say that, but others clearly viewed the parallel as something that was crystal clear, including the Weinthal Center and other experts in anti-Semitism who slammed the center. The center doubled down and said we denied it. The tweets are still online. You can read the articles. There's a whole string of articles. Now the center has invited a pro-BDS activist and left-wing anti-Semite whose views mirror right-wing anti-Semites to speak at a conference on April 11th. So I wrote an article about that today. The Wiesenthal Center, the article appeared online last night or today, has now urged the center to remove the name Anna Frank because it's mainstreaming anti-Semitism in a way that's unprecedented. Now, the center told me this speaker's not anti-Semitic. He said that the AJC, where we're at right now, basically pulls the strings of governments, and its views are, it's a mouthpiece for Israel, and he has all these typical anti-Jewish conspiracy theories about Jewish organizations, serving as the mouthpieces for the Israeli government and pulling the strings. Anyone familiar with AJC knows they've criticized Israel as well as praised Israel. But that doesn't matter when you're in the throes of an anti-Semitic ideology. The writer's name is Daniel Box, who they're inviting, or former left-wing journalist. He'll be speaking. When I asked the center and other supporters of his right to speak there, would you invite Udo Vogt, V-O-I-G-T, a German neo-Nazi member who's a member of the European Parliament, to speak? There's a small neo-Nazi party in Germany called the National Democratic Party, and people wouldn't answer the question. So the question is, why do you invite this person whose views are identical to a neo-Nazi to speak, but you wouldn't invite a neo-Nazi to speak? For example, they want this speaker, this former left-wing journalist, to speak on left-wing anti-Semitism. I asked them, would you invite someone like a neo-Nazi to speak on right-wing anti-Semitism? Surely they wouldn't. But they're inviting him, they're giving him a platform, they're mainstreaming him. And this is a center that's allegedly devoted to combating anti-Semitism in Germany. So you get a flavor of, I'm sorry to impose a form of clinical depression on all of you, but you get a flavor of how really terrible the situation is. In response to my article, Richard Kemp, who's many of you may know from his talks on the UN and Israeli security, is very well known, former commanding officer for the British forces in Afghanistan, wrote in response to my article on Twitter, or in response to the revelation about the Islamic State terrorists being compared to persecuted Jews during the Shoah. This is an insult, terrible insult to Anna Frank's name, and his tweet went viral. But there's no sense of from the center that we should perhaps delete the tweets or apologize or somehow switch gears and not invite a raging anti-Semite to speak at our conference on April 11th. So that's, I think, a very troubling aspect that once these disclosures are out there, it doesn't seem to inform German action. And the last point I want to make is Germany, again, the foreign minister said he went into politics because of Auschwitz. What I find interesting is he and the foreign ministry and Merkel's government, because she's in charge, are vehemently opposed to outlawing all of Hezbollah. As many of you probably saw, in March, the British government finally banned all of the Lebanese terrorist Shiite organization Hezbollah. Previously, the political wing could operate in Britain, raise funds and recruit new members, spread their lethal jihadi and anti-Semitic ideologies. Now the organization is fully banned. The European Union still has only banned the military wing and not the political wing. They make this bogus fiction of division between the two wings. The United States, Canada, the Arab League, now Britain, the Netherlands is the only other European country, have all declared Hezbollah to be a monolithic terrorist organization. Germany, where 950 Hezbollah members operate, according to the intelligence reports, vehemently refuses to outlaw the organization. So again, how does this square with Merkel's declaration that Israel's security is non-negotiable? And how does this square with Heiko Maas's declaration that he went into politics because of Auschwitz? The only answer is, well, not the only answer, one answer is total indifference, and one could argue, like people like Broder might argue, that many Germans, or at least there's an overwhelming sentiment within the German population, that Germany's indifference means that they really want the Iranians to finish the job. And that's why, because as folks know, Hezbollah is an internal organic part of Iran. One can't separate Hezbollah from Iran. It's a wholly owned subsidiary from the Islamic Republic of Iran. So Broder, who I mentioned earlier, has argued, let me just read this and I'll end here. This is from an article in Tablet on Broder, which you can read. So unfortunately, and this is what depresses me, is it's very difficult to translate this guy into English. It's almost impossible. I know the U.S. Embassy in Berlin has tried to translate it. They said this is Pulitzer level writing. We're having trouble because it's filled with all these, it's filled with all these, it's filled with so much satire and references. So this is what a writer in Tablet noted on Broder. Broder's most incendiary charge is that, though no German would admit this, they would be relieved if someone else would finish the job and so free Germany from its mark of Cain. Now this is Broder. Open quote, if Ahmadinejad, former president of Iran, were to attack Israel, close quote, Broder proclaimed, open quote, that would be for the Europeans a very happy event for two reasons. First, the second to last Holocaust would vanish in the midst of the last one, and second, they could make up for what they forgot to do between 33 and 45. They could express their solidarity with Jews. So the first part of his quote, where he says Europeans could be very happy because someone else could finish the job and free Germany from its mark of Cain, is this notion again of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. And that's what Broder's delving into here. And I think this is probably the least most understood form of anti-Semitism in Germany right now. The Germans simply don't want to deal with this type of criticism of why they're tolerating so much anti-Semitism in Germany and encouraging it. So I'll end there since it's 7 o'clock and I went on way too long. Why don't we open up for questions? Thanks for sitting through this.
So from what I understand, this is a growing movement of anti-Semitism, and there's no stopping it, from what
I'm just so curious, can you just tell me your name and where
Michael Steinberg.
Okay, Michael. What do you do?
Lawyer.
Okay, lots of lawyers here. Your question is, this is a growing movement?
Yeah, and there's no stopping it. It seems to be becoming more and more popular.
Right. I mean, I hate to deliver bad news, but you're right. I agree with you. It's a growing movement. The only difference now is there's more media attention paid to it. So everyone thinks there's more anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism, the magnitude of it has always been there. I think what's contributing to the nervousness on this side of the ocean from American Jewish organizations, American Jews, is that there's better media coverage of it right now. So that's a positive, but the negative is there's no policy action to counter it.
But don't you think that the
What's your name?
My name is Judy Kadish, and I'm Director of Americans for the State of Israel.
Okay.
Don't you think that the growing anti-Semitism in our government and in the United States is also cause for greater concern about what's happening overseas?
Greater concern for whom?
Greater concern on the part of Israel and the Jewish population here and overseas.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the Israelis are clearly concerned, and that's why, their strategic affairs minister, Gilad Erdan, has, devoted, there's an entire ministry devoted to combating the BDS movement.
Trump just appointed a minister to combating anti-Semitism.
That existed under Obama, too. I think, the United States clearly has a problem. I mean, you saw what happened in Pittsburgh, and now here in New York City, I'm following this Democratic councilman, I think he's a Democrat.
Because he's a Democrat.
Who said Palestine, doesn't exist. I mean, you could argue about that, but should that be reason to remove it from the council? That seems quite hysterical on my level, from my perspective. But, and then you have, I don't need to repeat what's happening in the United States. You folks know that much better than I do. You're immersed in what's happening with these Democrats and certain Democrats in Congress from Minnesota and New York and Michigan, and the reaction to them. I'm focused on Europe, and I think Obama's, I think Trump in many ways, based on his ambassador in Germany, I don't think you can draw any other conclusion that his ambassador, via the Trump administration, is working overtime to combat anti-Semitism. I haven't seen that type of activity from previous ambassadors, both on the Democrats and Republicans, for what it's worth.
It's worth a lot.
I just read a side on this, in the U.S. is that the freshman Congress people see Razmi Odeh as a star openly, and nobody thinks that's a big deal.
Yeah.
The terrorist from Jordan I'm referring to.
Yeah. I mean, that's, she's a
And
star.
mainstreaming anti-Semitism, basically.
Yeah. I'm going to show folks here, you may have seen him on Fox. He used to be a former Fox News contributor, Richard Brunel. For what it's worth, let's see, I have a picture of him. Oh, there he is on the right-hand side. You can see he was worked for 4 U.S. ambassadors to the UN. So that's the gentleman there, to mention a few. You can see what he did in Germany. He stopped Mayhem Air, got the Germans to stop, which was sending arms and money and personnel to Syria to help Assad wipe out, to commit mass murder. He stopped Iran's Mahan Air from using German airports, stopped Merkel's administration last year from delivering over $400 million to Iran's regime. Someone leaked it to him, and he put massive pressure on Merkel's government. So these are some of the things he's been doing lately. And he's also, I should mention, which is interesting, leading the effort to decriminalize homosexuality across the world, especially in Muslim-majority countries where there's a high incidence of lethal homophobia. So,
It doesn't impress progressives here.
sorry?
It does not impress progressives.
Yeah. So it's
What can you say?
yeah.
Going back to talking about diplomatic representatives, and you touched on, I forget the term for it, but they had like a regional, I guess, monitors for anti-Semitism in Germany. And you were saying that the concept, I guess, wasn't working well because they were centralizing things.
Right.
And I understand the monitor basically wasn't doing its job and was instead proliferating the issue. But what would you prefer seeing instead to, I guess, address the problem, if it's possible to address?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, Germany's also implemented this registry system where and you can register incidents of anti-Semitism. The problem has been also Germany's statistics are largely bogus in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of classifying it, because the Germans classify Islamic anti-Semitism under right-wing anti-Semitism. So, you know, and that's, we all know that's where most of anti-Semitism is unfolding right now in Europe. It's just, you know, that's the reality. You know, it may be different in the United States, you know, in terms of day-to-day incidents of anti-Semitism, but in Europe, it's Islamic animated anti-Semitism. It's
Where they
Muslim-based.
classify it as.
Yeah. And so that's one problem. So the registry system, again, is another sign of a societal recipe for disaster or a breakdown. Because all these reactions, as I mentioned, are defensive and show that Germany simply doesn't have a grasp on how to deal with the problem. You know, basically these are, you know, they're scratching the surface of the problem, they're band-aids. What could be done? Immediately, one could outlaw all of Hezbollah. One should break off relations with Iran's government, Iran's regime, evict the ambassador right away, because the ambassador to Iran just went to, and I didn't have time to mention this, I'll mention now, just met with the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Not the ambassador, I'm sorry, the cultural attaché from Iran's embassy went to Berlin's Jewish Museum, had a meeting with the director where they both discussed why Zionism is not anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. The director of the museum, Peter Schaefer, is non-Jewish. It doesn't matter because there's Jews in Germany who are anti-Semites. But he hosted the cultural attaché from the Iranian embassy, basically mainstreamed Iran's anti-Semitism. I wrote about this for the Jerusalem Post. This museum is very problematic because they've hosted Judith Butler, who gave a pro-BDS speech, this literary professor from Berkeley, who, you know, so a friend of mine, Andy Markowitz, said once, she's considered the world's worst academic writer. She won some award for her prose being unintelligible, but she has an amazing commitment to clarity when she writes about BDS and other issues. As my friend Andy Markowitz said, a professor from Michigan, she suddenly has crystal clear writings when she's bashing Israel. Everyone can understand it, but on every other topic she writes about, she's a gender theorist. No one can understand it. In any event, the museum in Berlin hosted her, and she gave a pro-BDS speech. I attended it to report on it, and 700 Germans were roaring with approval. This is in the Berlin Jewish Museum. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about the German Jewish community. You mentioned there are 1 million Jews in Europe. So what would be the number in Germany? Are they mostly descendants of Holocaust survivors, or are they immigrants, or, you know, what's kind of their origin? And then thirdly, how are they reacting to all this that's going on? I mean, is there any kind of protest, or they're thinking about Aliyah, or they're just kind of passive?
Good question. Good question. What your name is?
I'm Gail Kesselman.
What do you do?
I'm a doctor,
Oh,
semi-retired doctor, psychiatrist.
ah, exactly what we need here. Wow, impressive. Let me just, one second, I'll revisit your question because I just want to finish up answering Ira's question. So I mentioned outlawing Hezbollah, I think shutting down Iran's embassy, recalling their ambassador to send a message that we're not in the business, that is, the German government's not in the business of cooperating or recognizing the leading international sponsor of lethal anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and terrorism. That is Iran's regime. Right? Canada doesn't have relations with Iran. The United States doesn't. So the Germans could follow the lead in that case. Other areas where they could do is, they have these hate speech laws. They could, I know the United States has its First Amendment, but they have different laws there that they don't really enforce. They could enforce those laws, maybe expand on them to capture modern expressions of anti-Semitism. Because it's, as I mentioned, anti-Semitism is there so wildly out of control. I'm not a fan of, cracking down on free speech, but this is what could, I guess, curtail some of it from the point of view of some advocates. What else? Let me just finish. I'm sorry. The other areas where they could vet their, in terms of immigration, they could vet immigrants better. I mean, it doesn't help on some level when you allow unfettered immigration to take place when over 1 million refugees, migrants, however you want to define the folks, they have different definitions, enter your country from Muslim-majority countries that are steeped in hatred of Jews and Israel. You somehow accept them. You have no plan to deal with it. So I think that's, that's already an existing problem, but that's sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room that no one wants to deal with. What else can they do? They could do more Israel education for journalists, more exchanges. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. There's all that type of stuff for the younger generation. They could have more exchanges, better curricula in terms of Israel and the Holocaust, more on the secondary anti-Semitism, what I call the guilt offensiveness anti-Semitism, all that type of stuff. But to just, I'll come back to you. Is it Peter?
Yes.
Peter, I'll come back to you. Just to feed into what Gail was saying, because it dovetails into her question. It dovetails in the way that you asked what can be done, basically. And that's a question that I think German Jews are struggling with right now, and how they should respond, as Gail asked, and I can also offer my 2 shekels on what I think they should do. There are about a little less than 100,000 Jews registered in the country with the so-called Central Council of Jews in Germany. Sounds a bit like the Politburo. They have these very sort of obsolete terms. They used to have a general secretary, but they abolished that position a few years ago. So they have a Central Council of Jews in Germany that's funded by the German government. So they have a newspaper. They're very reticent about criticizing the German government. Of the 100,000 who are there, 70,000, one could argue, are from the former Soviet Union or the post-Holocaust Jewish community that remained in Germany were mainly Jews from Poland and some Jews from Germany in the DP camps, or survived the Holocaust and for whatever reason stayed in Germany. There's all sorts of different stories. And that was 30,000 before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you've got a very small, again, you have over 82 million people in Germany, so very small community. Some estimates are that, one estimate, there are maybe 200,000 Jews in Europe. No one really knows. But of the registered Jews that we know of, under 100,000, a little under. How are they reacting? Some of them are, they're pushed for these, some of them communities are pushing for these anti-Semitism commissioners. So they've self-organized some NGOs to fight anti-Semitism, to assess it. And again, I'm engaging in sort of a large generalization, a sweeping generalization, because there's different communities, right, in the 16 different states. Some favor, push for this registry, but they're largely sort of impotent on some level, because they can't, the German government doesn't really pay much attention to them on the big issues, like outlaw Hezbollah. The German government ignores them. Stop trading with Iran, because Germany's the biggest trade partner of Iran. So Germany's pushing right now to bust American sanctions against Iran's regime. Right? The Germans, the French, and the British set up this special purpose vehicle in Paris to bust Trump sanctions against Iran. The Germans assigned their banker to run the special purpose vehicle, and the head of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, a doctor, he's a cardiologist, Dr. Joseph Schuster, told the Jerusalem Post, or an article I wrote, that Germany should end its trade with Iran. This was, I think, last year. And he said, in his comment, you can find the article online, I wrote about it in Tablet and the Jerusalem Post, that the Germans have not really learned the lessons from the Holocaust because they continue to trade with Germany. Germans ignored them. They're continuing the goose trade. So it's, my recommendation to young German Jews, and actually all German Jews living in Germany, is they should just make Aliyah. It's a wasted future there. It's just going to get progressively worse. Or I guess, when they make Aliyah, they could emigrate to Anglo-American countries where there's, where you're still safe, like the United States. or Australia, I guess, Canada. This Great Britain right now is ground zero for anti-Semitism in the West. It's not a good place. So they have a very bleak future, a bleak assessment for the future of Jews in Germany. Again, very small numbers. They're running scared, many of them, scared of their own shadows, many of them, not all. Many of them, in a psychological sense, adopt the assimilation ideas of Germany and don't want to, rock the boat. Many of them have unfortunately embraced the hardcore anti-Israeli attitudes of mainstream German society. Because what happened in Germany is, when I did my master's on German Jewish thinker. My father's from Germany, so I have some background in this field. I wish I'd learned French because the food's better. But I'll just end here and then go to Peter's question. Whereas the time of Heine, and these great German Jewish poems, Heinrich Heine in the 1800s, German Jews, or Marx, right? His family was forced, who was an anti-Semite, who wrote anti-Semitic writings, were forced or voluntarily converted to Catholicism or Protestantism because they wanted to assimilate into society and rise up. What's happening in Germany right now is where there was that forced religious conversion process for many German Jews back then. There was this notion of compulsion in order to assimilate and succeed. Now what you have is this notion of compulsion to convert to anti-Zionism. So you see the success, of the Act Two of religious-based anti-Semitism moving into political anti-Semitism, where Jews who are might be supportive of Israel, or somewhat supportive, or indifferent, or supportive, are in many ways forced because of the enormous pressures of German society to convert to being anti-Zionist or hardcore critics, to the point that you notice that there's a disconnect here. This person shouldn't devote that much criticism to Israel. What's happening here? And what can explain it, I think, are the social and political conditions in Germany where it's socially and politically correct to hold views that are anti-Semitic. So who's next? Peter.
I now have two questions. Have they signed on to the EU Commission, the definition of anti-Semitism? You know what I'm talking about?
They have.
They have. And my second question is, have you faced...
Does everyone know what he's talking about? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Refresh on.
Why don't you just say what the definition?
Well, the Labour Party in England finally signed on to this definition because the debate between being critical of Israel and being anti-Semitic was a big debate. And so some commission, I forget who they are, EU Commission on Racism, I think they were, came up with the definition of what anti-Semitism is. And so my question is, did the German government sign on to that? British government has, and many, many others. And I think it's very important because it makes it very clear that yes, you can criticize Israel, but if you think that Israel shouldn't exist, that's not a legitimate criticism of Israel. That's anti-Semitism. Anyway, that's the definition. You can look it up. The other question is, have you faced personal anti-Semitism? Or, well, I mean, everybody knows you're a Jewish journalist from the Jerusalem Post, but have you faced, I'm sure you get, on your tweet, you get a lot of comments.
Twitter's a bottomless pit of anti-Semitism, so that's expected. Germany's you get all sorts of letters and hate mail, all that sort of stuff. It's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
You
have a security detail?
I was a collegiate wrestler. I made All-American. I take care of myself. I wrestled here in New York. It's a very popular sport, as many of you know, in New York State. So I don't worry about it. I think the German Jewish leaders have security details, but their bodyguards and that type of stuff, but it's, yeah, not a big deal. Yeah,
Yeah,
so your name is Mike?
Martin.
Martin, what do you do?
I'm sorry?
What do you do?
Well, I'm retired.
Okay. What did you do?
Well, I was in charge of enforcement in the Weights and Measures Division, then I became a teacher after I retired.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, I have a little bit of a problem. While I agree that the explanation of the defensive guilt of the Holocaust can explain a lot in Germany, and it's a poem variation of blaming the victim. You extended it to Europe in general, and I have some problems with that, and then a larger problem with the thesis. I can understand the defensive guilt from the Holocaust in Germany, obviously, Austria, Hungary, Poland, the Baltic countries. It doesn't explain it to me for the anti-Semitism that you're seeing now in England, Scandinavia, Greece, Spain. So, and what's happening in the United States now with the anti-Semitism that's surfacing in the left. To understand that, you touched on it. The metamorphosis of anti-Semitism throughout the ages. I mean, the thing about anti-Semitism, it's such a universal and old hatred, and it metamorphosizes to meet the time. So, with the event of Constantine, Christian anti-Semitism, which existed for almost 2,000 years, then the Enlightenment came, and the Enlightenment and the Reformation sort of made that kind of anti-Semitism not so acceptable. So then you had the rise of political, as you mentioned, political anti-Semitism in the 1870s, as Jews were getting their emancipation in Europe. And then that metamorphosed to the racial anti-Semitism of the Nazis. And then the Holocaust, of course, did away with that. That became unacceptable. And now, what you have is the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism. That's the acceptable anti-Semitism now. So, I think that concentrating on just this aspect of the Holocaust anti-Semitism can blur the bigger picture, which is anti-Semitism in general and what causes it and how you respond to it. That's a little bit of the problem that I'm having now, and that now, I mean, the event of Israel, which was a response largely to the Holocaust, thank God, but it was the perfect stop for the anti-Semites and the guilt of the Holocaust, because now we can transfer the guilt of the Holocaust to Israel, which they've done. But that's also true on the left. See, I don't believe the right-wing German anti-Semites have transferred that, but the left-wing anti-Semites have transferred that guilt from the Holocaust, and Europeans in general, which was endemic in Europe. They've transferred that to anti-Israel. And that's I think, should really be the focus now. It's just the latest manifestation of anti-Semitism. And
Question is, I'm sorry.
all right, so the thing is, I see limitations on the analysis that you gave in Germany. That's what I'm saying. I understand it for Germany, particularly it's a horrible situation. They are with the mark of Cain. They will have that forever, that mark, and that hurts them. That irritates them. It gets them angry. But I can't see that extending to most of the rest of Europe.
Then how does one explain? Look, as I said, good questions are good answers. This is I think a topic that very powerful minds try to explain. They're struggling with, like,
what's the reason for anti-Semitism to begin with?
I mean, I mentioned these thinkers Adorno and Horkheimer who who tried to fuse Marxism with Freudianism, and with these thinkers on a level that
Well, if I just made it, my wife has an excellent. She says because we gave them rope of conscience. That's why they hate the Jews. But she took it back to the Bible. But anyway.
But that's an interesting point. But I think what I'm delving into is why is there this disproportionate attention, criticism devoted only to Israel, mainly in Western Europe? What is this infatuation with, with seeking to go to great lengths to criticize Israel and at times dismantle Israel's existence in the press, in academia? I mean, I've never seen such intense devotion to any other country in Western Europe. So now, countries like Greece that were complicit in the Holocaust, countries like Spain that was not complicit,
Scandinavia was not.
although Spain didn't allow Jews to enter, right?
Right,
The border,
right.
there were cases. Scandinavia, of course, was complicit. These countries are right now saturated with anti-Semitism, and I don't know, I'm trying to find another explanation for what that's about, and it strikes me as the same notion that, well, wait a second, our historians have delved into our role in the Holocaust and helping deport Jews and murder Jews, and now the state of Israel exists. And I think it is in many ways a natural extension of Adorno and Horkheimer's argument that there is a form of guilt offense in this anti-Semitism in these countries. Now, Great Britain, you mentioned, and Spain are different countries, and I don't know enough about those countries. I did study. I did study in the United Kingdom, but I don't. I've heard different explanations from experts who deal with the United Kingdom. I think that's a different animal, and I think Spain is a bit of a different animal on some level. But again, the high volume of anti-Semitic attitudes in mainly Western European nations that were complicit in the Holocaust, Austria too, Switzerland, because of its role in
I happen to be from Sweden, and Sweden is exactly, I totally buy your point.
I paid him to say that before this session started.
Well,
Peter and I met.
Can I try to offer something?
Yeah.
Because I can see that, like I said, I can see the populations, the large populations in Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ukraine, Lithuania, where they were actually guards, and I can see in those populations that kind of a guilt. I can't see that in most of the populations in Britain or Spain, even though their governments may have been complicit. But one thing I can see in the populations of Europe in general is colonialism. There's a defensive guilt towards colonialism, especially today. And that to me would explain, again, Israel fits perfectly into this. It's a colonial outpost, a Western colonial outpost that's destroying or subjugating an endemic population, and it's illegal. So that to me would go further to explain the anti-Israel attitude in most of Western Europe than the Holocaust,
But actually,
and the populations. Now,
then
I could be wrong, but I'm just saying that would be.
I have to totally disagree with you. The narrative of colonialism in Israel is bogus. A majority of
course
Jews.
it's bogus, but that's not the
A
issue.
majority of Jews came from the North Africa and Middle East.
Of course it's bogus. Nobody's arguing that. If Jews
leftists
return,
is arguing that.
in fact, Israel is probably the least colonial because it's no argument that they returned to their own land after 2,000 years. They didn't steal it. They nobody's arguing that. But anti-Semitism is based on a lie in general. So this is just a lie against Israel now. So what I'm saying is the left on the anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel anti-Semitism, or the manifestation of anti-Semitism, which is anti-Israelism on the left, is that it's a colonial power. Of course, it's not true, but that would explain that to me, and the leftism that we see growing in this country and on the college campuses, much more than goes to the Holocaust.
Isn't that intersectionality?
I'm sorry? Yes, there's so many facets to it. That's what I'm saying. A reliance on this, just on this, to explain what's going on in Germany, may be so in Germany, I can see, but to extend it to Europe in general and beyond, I have a problem with that.
Yeah, fair criticism.
I'm an immigration lawyer. We are, and
Where were you when I came?
I used to be an inspector at the airport, and my job there was to let everybody in as quickly as possible. Just so everybody understands, I did that for many years.
Wow.
Amazing. And what troubles me is, until Trump became president, is that Germany and Europe let in all these migrants of childbearing age, while everybody else is getting older and has no religion and no kids. So, in a way, it's very disturbing if you think about the future of Europe. And my only hope is that Trump gets reelected and can continue with men like Grinnell, and maybe something will happen.
There was some discussion, you may have read this in the papers, he was, after Nikki Haley stepped down as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, he was one of the contenders. And then there was some, it was during that period, so who knows what will happen with this guy's future.
Do you think this Holocaust guilt is one reason why Merkel opened Germany up to the migrants?
Some people think that. I mean, that, she wanted to, show the good German side and purge
She's
guilt.
destroying Europe.
There's a lot of that at work. I think. I haven't analyzed enough what the motive. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to why she opened the borders. That's one reason. It strikes me as probably a number of different factors. One BBC article, I think, argued that it was what Michael was talking about, Robert, I'm sorry.
No problem.
That's what happens when you hit 50. Usually better names. About the workforce in Germany, this idea that it's an aging population. We were talking a bit about demographics. That this BBC article argued this was sort of a labor economics reason for her opening the borders. What I should say, there's also a in terms of the guilt anti-Semitism, I mentioned this earlier, there's sort of also a moral anti-Semitism in Germany. And I didn't quote him during my talk, but I should have mentioned him. He just died. He's a German writer named Wolfgang Port. Not many people know of him. He's a journalist, author. He died last year. He was also very non-Jewish, very insightful about Germany's commemoration culture, memorialization. And he noted that what's happened in Germany since the Holocaust is a sort of a sense of uber morality for the Germans. And his argument was the Germans are now in a position, because they have Holocaust memorials, they've commemorated dead Jews, there's all sorts of, I get just so many mails each week about another commemoration for dead Jews in Germany. Seems like that's what my mailbox fills with all the time. Now I just delete them. The Port said that what Germany is now, Germany's position right now toward Jews and Israelis is, I'm quoting him, is open quote, Germans seek to prevent the victims from relapsing, close quote. So Germans, according to this writer, this is another form of anti-Semitism that's rarely discussed, but it's a gorgeous insight. I'm envious of him. I wish I had discovered it. Where Germans sort of serve as the probation officer for Israelis and Jews, because they argue, many of them, we've been through this. We know what world wars are about. We know what mass murders are about. That's why you should make peace with Hamas. That's why you should make peace with Hezbollah. That's why you should engage in these deep concessions, of course at the risk of the security of the state of Israel. But it's this, and Port was onto something here when he said that Germans are functioning as, many Germans, and we see this with politicians, lecturing the Israelis all the time, because they don't want to prevent the victims from relapsing. It's as if the Jews, or in the case of the Israelis now, went through Auschwitz as a form of behavioral therapy, that this was a reform school they went to. And now that they were released, they should have learned the lessons, and they haven't learned the lessons. So you have a hectoring German telling you, make concessions with Hezbollah and Hamas in Iran. Don't worry about Iran's nuclear program. Even though they threaten to exterminate Israel on a weekly basis, they're not serious about it. You know? But of course, when you point out there was someone in the 1920s in Germany who made similar threats, he was just called a big mouth. And you know, folks said not to take him seriously back then. You know, it was laughed off. Yeah.
I read a very interesting book by Yoram Hazony, The Virtual Nationalism.
I haven't read it, I'm aware of it. You know.
What you're just talking about, based on, I remember there was one section of the book where it talks about how Germans and Israelis both look at the Holocaust and they drew diametrically opposite lessons from it. The Germans look at Auschwitz and they say, this is what happens when you have a strong state. This is the end result of nationalism. The Israelis look at Auschwitz and they say, this is what happens when you don't have a strong, you're not even a strong state, but any state. So they both look at the same thing and they draw completely opposite lessons from it. And I think that ties into what
It does, and
the moral.
exactly. Because Port would take it a step further and say, you're right, that's the model that he wrote in his book. He would take it a step further. Now the Germans are actually sort of getting a holier than thou high horse and saying, moment, we're here to supervise you.
We learned the lesson.
Right, and it's,
If you didn't learn it.
we have this Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, we have this Jewish Museum, and we have, all this type of, we have commemoration events in January and November. We do all this type of stuff. We just donated $1 million, or you probably saw the news item, the Dortmund Soccer Club, or donated $1 million to Yad Vashem. My preference would be donate $1 million to the IDF. They could use it.
Excuse me, may I ask, when you said that the Israelis have the view that Auschwitz was the result of not having a strong state, were they
Yes.
pointing to Weimar? Is that what they were
No,
saying?
they were pointing to.
That the
Nazi
Weimar
Germany.
Republic couldn't control
No,
the
they
right
were
of that.
talking about Nazi Germany.
But I'm saying that that would be the strong state, but I'm saying Nazism arose partially because the Weimar government couldn't contain it, because the conditions in Weimar Germany couldn't. That's why I was just asking if that's what the Israelis meant by not a strong state.
Well, it was,
Seems to me that the Israelis want a strong Israeli state
Right.
to
Of
avoid.
Of course.
That's-
That is how I read it, yes.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was Merkel doing the Iranians a favor? Get a little of this from the John Batchelor show. When the Iranians evicted all the Shiites, am I getting this right? All the Shiites from Syria into Germany. In other words, the Iranians want to make Syria.
They're making Sunnis.
Excuse me. So the Iranians want to make Syria a Shiite state.
Right.
And so they evict the Sunnis, and Merkel does them a favor and welcomes and brings not hundreds of thousands, but millions into Germany.
That's an interesting theory, but I think I don't think Merkel was thinking in those terms that to aid Iran, she could help depopulate Syria from its Sunni population, because this took place in, I mean, it's a very novel theory. I have to give you, interesting
Well, maybe
idea.
the Persians were thinking that maybe we can get over Merkel. Well, let's do this.
Yeah.
She'll-
I mean, it
I'm
was
sorry to
very-
interrupt.
No, it was mainly, again, I don't see that as the idea that Merkel somehow had a plan to she's strengthening Iran in her own ways. I don't think that this depopulation plan to spread Iran's tentacles across, the region were part of the plan. I mean, she has said, at least her rhetoric, is, last year or the year before, the EU has to counter Iran's aggression. She said that in Jordan during a trip last year. She's done nothing to counter it, of course, but she gives these statements across, and then You know, the Israeli government at times was, oh, Merkel issued a statement, you know, great. But, you know, then I'll ask the Israeli government as a reporter, well, you know, what does she plan to do? Have you asked her? You know, does she plan to, for example, outlaw Hezbollah in Germany so they can't continue to send funds from Germany to Lebanon that aid Hezbollah, because that's what's taking place right now. It's all in the open source German intelligence documents about the money transfers, but no one gets bent out of shape about it in Germany. So I don't think, I think it's probably what Martin was saying, a combination of purging guilt and then, you know, this idea that Germany's population is the demographics of Germany, the worker shortage in Germany, Merkel's Protestant background. She's the daughter of a Protestant pastor. That might play a role in it, I've heard. You know, this sort of deep altruistic sense that's embedded in some, you know, in Christian thought played a role. But in the end, who really knows what was whirling around in her head? She obviously made a terrible mistake for the Jews in Germany.
But not for the Persians, not for the Iranians.
For the Iranians, in the end, it helps them. You're right, because of what's happening. I mean, that's a, you know, it's a shame. Right. Right. I think are we close to a few
Do
minutes?
we have any last questions or anything?
So, just to wrap up, I think a lot of organizations and individuals here are feeling a little bit scared right now. We're at a turning point here, and so do you have any insight for us based on your study of Germany and Europe about what kinds of actions and things could we employ here to stop the rise of what we perceive, many of us I think, as of unfettered and unchecked anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, the state-sponsored anti-Semitism, which, as I mentioned, is quite prevalent in Germany right now. You look at the UN policy in there, in the Bundestag. There was an effort, I failed to mention this too, my apologies, there was an effort to reverse Merkel's anti-UN voting policy. Last month, one party submitted a resolution stating that Germany should change its pattern at the UN, and it was overwhelmingly defeated by all, you know, in the Bundestag. You can look it up. So it gives you a sense of how deeply ingrained Merkel's state-sanctioned discriminatory policy against Jews is in Israel right now. State-sanctioned anti-Semitism here, state-sponsored or political anti-Semitism in the case of these representatives. I mean, this is tough work. Just having worked in power politics when I was younger, you know, you need to primary these people, right, in the United States, in Minnesota and Michigan. You need to run candidates. And you need to, you know, I mean, op-eds and tweets and Facebook posts are all nice, but you need divisions out
Take it
there.
seriously.
Yeah, you need people on the ground. You need to engage in organizing. You know, it's like Mother Jones said, "Don't mourn, organize." And my sense is among American Jews right now. Again, I've been very divorced from this. My sense is American Jews have lost that track of organizing the unorganized and mobilizing the unmobilized. In this sense, to defeat political anti-Semitism. So you have to get on the ground in Minneapolis or wherever she's from, in Minnesota. You have to get on the ground in that part of Michigan. You have to get in the part where I'm staying right now, in Pelham Bay, in the Bronx, where one political representative is one. My best friend lives there, so I'm staying with him, and I saw all the placards. So it's not anything intellectually more complex than organizing, as I said. I don't think taking out ads in newspapers.
Or marching on Washington.
Yeah, you have to go into these communities and win over the hearts and minds of people and say, look, you know, these are anti-Semites, and, you know, make intersectionality argument, as Robert just said, that anti-Semitism is related to, you know, obviously it's more dangerous than racism and homophobia, because the inner workings of anti-Semitism are always about eliminatory anti-Semitism. Death, right? wants to murder people. That's what anti-Semitism is about.
My understanding is in some of these districts, not the Bronx, but some of these other districts, that the Muslim population outnumbers the other population at this point. And,
Well, you have to win over the Muslims to do that. I mean, I read articles in the New York Times where some of the Somali Americans in these districts were very critical of her. What's her name? Elon. And we're saying this is not what we want her to do in Congress. We want her to represent our economic needs, basic economic needs. Again, then you have to work with Somali Americans in those communities who agree with you. Run a Somali American against you. There's all sorts of ways to do it, but again, I think American Jews, many, I should say, have somehow drifted away from this organizing track. And that's dangerous, because in the end, it's what AOC did in the Bronx. You can out-organize people. You have to get on the ground. The other things I would suggest, and again, I'm no expert in what's happening in America because I've been away for a very long time. I live in Israel, I go to Berlin, that's where I do my work. Is the BDS and the academy. I don't know enough about it, but it's obviously that's one of the major problems here. Again, it's I spoke to Robert. He's Marco Rubio's national security advisor, Robert Zaragi. Just get the name right. Anyway, I show. And this is the national security advisor for Marco Rubio, who's excellent on Israel issues, right? He told me when I met with him about BDS, and he's working on legislation, right? I mean, he's immersed in this stuff on a daily basis to stop anti-Semitism on campuses and in American society. He said to me a few years ago, at the end of the day, the most important factor is grassroots organizing versus grassroots organizing on these campuses. That's what's going to win it. Now, Jews are a minority, so you have to form alliances with non-Jews. That can be done. But, it requires, it's very difficult work, it's very grueling work, it's very, taxing and time-consuming. You have to spit up blood and you're sweating and that. I know all that because I've done it. But it's the only way that you're going to prevail in the end. I'm not a big believer in brochures and leaflets and op-ed. I mean, that's all great stuff. But to win over the hearts and minds of Americans, when you talk to them patiently and slowly about these issues, like BDS, I'm talking about ordinary Americans, not the fanatics from the BDS camp, just the undecided, to those who haven't thought about it on campus or who are mildly supportive of Israel, you can win them over on these issues. They get it once you patiently explain it to them. I've seen that happen. I think Americans are very reasonable. They don't have any of the baggage of, what took place in Europe. They're not filled with all this, clinical insanity about, trying to, bash Israel and Jews because, they feel guilty about the Holocaust. So there's great potential here, but it takes those types of resources. I don't know how money's being spent here, if there's that type of grassroots organizing taking place. I'm just not, not on the campuses. And it has to be young people too. It has to be, this 18, 19-year-old from Scranton, Pennsylvania talking to this other 18, 19-year-old or 17-year-old from, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on the campus of, Penn State. Why you should support this anti-Israeli boycott. Preferably a non-Jewish person.
That's why organizations like Stand With Us are very important. They work on college campuses, I understand, too.
But they're not doing what he's talking about.
Well, part of it is because the colleges now are so far they won't allow free speech. You can't even talk about Israel. It's
Right.
scary.
There's something at Harvard now, I think.
It's really
passing
scary.
the Israel resolution, I read. Or I
I
saw something on
I
it.
think Trump will fix it.
I think it's deeper than Trump. I think
You know,
what you said has to be.
I just want to say, how we stood in front of Gillibrand's office against the JCPOA, and it meant nothing. All the work we did in New York, it meant nothing. Our senators stabbed us in the back. And so it makes you realize how the people of power, the Stalin and the Hitlers, really control everything. But thank God we have our man in the White House. It's a miracle. And so that's what gives me faith that it'll be all right. Because I think it's all from the top down.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about Trump in the United States. I do know that,
How is he perceived in Germany? Trump as a person, forget.
oh, he's hated,
He
because
really
he
hated.
wants the Germans to, but all American politicians have been hated in Germany. Anti-Americanism has, since the Holocaust, has been stable. I mean, yes, there might be more of a spike because of Trump, but it's still, Obama was despised because the Nationals had the NSA thing, you know, or America was under Obama. Clinton, there's another very witty comment from someone who, it's sort of an outgrowth of the comment from Zivi Rex about Germans. Another German commentator said, the Germans will never forgive the Americans for defeating the National Socialists. So that's the anti-American version of it, where the Germans are disgusted. Again, speaking in generalities, I know that putting scary quotes on all this because the camera's rolling. The Germans are, disgusted with the Americans, or have this, or enraged and filled with anti-Americanism because the Americans defeated the Hitler movement. They weren't able to do it, and they lost. So you see a high level of anti-Americanism under both Democrats and Republicans. So Trump, when people say, "Oh, Trump's creating anti-Americanism," no, anti-Americanism is creating anti-Americanism in Germany. That's the problem. That's what you need to deal with, not with Trump. Trump's criticized Germany because of the defense budget, because you're relying on Putin for energy. His criticisms on Germany are totally on the money. And German commentators, a few of them, have agreed with Trump on these issues. So I don't buy that argument that the anti-Americanism is a result of Trump. If that makes sense. But that's a whole other topic. There's a good guy who's written about this book a number of years ago. I mentioned him, Andy Markowitz, professor at the University of Michigan, German studies and political science. He wrote a whole book about anti-Americanism in Europe, a lot in Germany. It's a very, very good book. There's not much out there on this, about the interplay between anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism.